I think it's really illuminating to think that we participate in a kind of patriarchal violence just by when we refer to the creature as Frankenstein. Um, I mean, I don't want to over dramatize it. It's just a fictional character, but in fact, I want to emphasize that what this text is about, how you know bodies are at stake in fiction, in language. The texts are a way of dealing with bodies, of treating bodies, that's at stake. Um, uh, and This marginalization of the creature's body, disregard, um, is it's not just about the creature, it's an attitude in language. It's an attitude toward the world. Um, uh, and it's a very central, powerful attitude in our world, in its expression in patriarchy and in science. The sort of what I've been talking about in terms of the view from nowhere, the knowledge of the world as founded on a disembodied perspective. What it means to really know and understand, have correct knowledge of the world, means to be disembodied. Means to not be biased by an embodied reality, especially a minority body. One of the most powerful things this novel does is finally align the body of the creature with the body of the reader. Um, so I want you to just sort of have that in your mind. There's an alignment of the otherness, the minority, marginal status of the creature's body, the marginal status of women. Um, the surrogate reader of the novel, Walton's sister, is a woman. So we're reading in the perspective of a body of that's neglected or silenced, disregarded by a lot of this narrative that's dominated by uh, this patriarchal, disembodied scientific authority and male rivalry. So let's begin finally with the Walton's introductory narrative and see what we can notice about it. So, what strikes you? How do you characterize Walton? What kind of guy is he? What is he after? What's his motive? Um, how does he think of himself? How does he describe himself? Well, I mean, he's quite deluded, just like Frankenstein. I just was talking about how, distorted Frankenstein's perspective was on the creature's birth, how he wasn't able to, properly see the creature. His narrative is so front loaded with judgmental characterization of the creature's horrid contrast, his contrast to his lack of his monstrosity. I think you might say Walton is a little bit on the other end of the spectrum in his characterization of the North Pole. He's has a similar kind of binary contrast in his mind. He's like, if it's a land of eternal light, can't must be wonderful because light is good. Like that seems to be kind of a lot the level of his logic. Um, let's just see if you notice other kind of contradictions or weirdness in this initial paragraph. I've highlighted some sections that I think are revealing. I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as the region of beauty and light, beauty and delight. There, Margaret, the sun is forever visible. Like, are you talking about the North Pole, or are you talking about your imagination? Like, is that there in my imagination, or that he's kind of confused the two? He's telling Margaret his vision of what the North Pole is and treating that as if it's authoritative. There, Margaret, the sun is forever visible, its broad disk just skirting the horizon and diffusing a perpetual splendor. There, I will put some trust in preceding navigators. The snow and frost are banished, and, sailing over a calm sea, we may be wafted to a land surpassing in wonders and in beauty every region hitherto discovered on the habitable globe. Its productions and features may be without example as the phenomena of the heavenly bodies undoubtedly are in those undiscovered solitudes. What may be expected in a country of eternal light? I'm not sure what he means by these preceding. He makes it sound as if he's relying on some empirical data, but I mean, that's a theme in both Walton and Victor, is that they rely on dubious scientific authorities. Now, what in particular is he? What's the particular object of his search and desire? How does he describe it? In effect, he's describing heaven. He's, what may not be expected. He just wants to go to heaven. So he's, you can see he's on a kind of an implicitly suicide mission. But here he describes what he might discover in an interesting way. It has to do with the secret of the North Pole, the power that attracts the needle. So I may discover the wondrous power which attracts the needle, and may regulate 1,000 celestial observations that require only this voyage to render their seeming eccentricities consistent forever. What does that mean? I mean, it's sort of the secret of life. Like, it's much like, Victor's ambition. He wants to find the formula that will decode the seeming eccentricities of life, the accidents, the unpredictable aspects of life will be rendered consistent forever and regulated. He again, there's a kind of resistance of life underlying this, his desire. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. Again, he's there's something deeply antisocial in the picture he paints of the desirability of the North Pole, his interest in the North Pole. I mean, he's describing the view from nowhere of scientific knowledge, authoritative knowledge. It will regulate the world. It's an escape from society, and it's a perspective from which all the weird, unpredictable details of life will be regulated and made consistent and ordered. Now listen to how he, the other side of his motivation that he begins to articulate here. These are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death, and induce me to commence this laborious voyage with the joy a child feels when he embarks in a little boat with his holiday mates on an expedition of discovery up his native river. Now, that seems a little out of place, given everything he said before. Now he's this journey to escape society and regulate the eccentricities of the world, is supposed to make him feel like a child playing with his friends in nature, exploring, and that's what he's obviously confused. He's describing sort of the opposite of. He thinks his mission's going to make him feel the opposite of how he's actually characterized his mission, and this tension or contradiction becomes more explicit as he continues. I have one want which I have never been able to satisfy, in the absence of the object of which I now feel is a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. Yeah, maybe it's because you are totally antisocial, you want to regulate and control the world. When I'm glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I'm assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection. I'll commit my thoughts to paper, it's true. That's a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who would sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. That's really key. That's that primal social bond of mutual recognition is a key event in throughout this novel in different situations. We've already seen it in the moment of birth, and it's this defining situation of social identity. You may deem me romantic, my sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. I have no one near me, gentle yet courageous, possessed of a cultivated as well as of a capacious mind, whose tastes are like my own, to approve or amend my plans. How would such a friend repair the faults of your poor brother? So here he's, I think, more accurately characterizing himself with truer, insight into himself. This is what he actually wants. And, again, like Victor, or sort of foreshadowing Victor, his scientific ambitions are misplaced, displaced, expression of his desire for a friend, for social bond, um, and uh, it's misplaced. It's a distortion of this social desire, this desire for friendship, companionship, mutual recognition. Um, that's distorted in the same way as patriarchy distorts society. Um, uh, w- Turning society into something to control and understand, and into a reflection of oneself, a narcissistic fantasy, rather than this scene of mutual recognition of interaction. Um, so he recognizes the limits of his education, and the distortion of his education. For the first 14 years of my life, I ran wild on a common and read nothing but our Uncle Thomas's books of voyages. That age, I became acquainted with the celebrated poets of my country. It was only when I had ceased to be in my power to derive its most important benefits from such a conviction that I perceived the necessity of becoming acquainted with more languages than that of my native country. Now I'm 28 and am in reality more illiterate than many schoolboys of 15. So again, the authorities he's relying on is for testimony about the North Pole are pretty dubious. Here's another really key passage. It's true that I have thought more and my daydreams are more extended and magnificent, but they want, as the painters call it, keeping. I greatly need a friend who would have sense enough not to despise me as romantic and affectionate enough for me to endeavor to regulate my mind. So he knows his mind is unregulated, and it's an expression of his lack of regulation that he desires this kind of inhuman, absolute regulation of everything under the sun, thousands celestial events. And the way he characterizes this regulation here is something quite different. It's what art provides: proportionality. What do the painters call keeping? It's aesthetic coherence, having things in proportion. A painting that's out of keeping is, lacks a kind of aesthetic balance. So he's using art as a model of friendship, with the way a friend will moderate, give you keeping, give you balance, an aesthetic measure of balance. It's really revealing there. Like art, it teaches us how to regulate, moderate our social relationships. It's much more like, a model, not of the regulation of making consistent and ordered in the manner of scientific knowledge, but harmonizing in the manner of music, or giving a visual coherence in the manner of a painting. It's that that ideal, that romantic ideal of friendship, that we create who we are through the relation we enact together. Our communication, we decide who we are and how we mutually recognize ourselves in our communication. Again, that idea of prosthetic personhood. our art, the means, the tools by which we communicate and that mediate our recognition of one another, define who we are. We define who we are through how we interact. This term that I think applies really nicely to this uh, text in various ways, nesting, like the idea of the nest is a prosthetic extension of the body of a bird. It's a seat of family. It's an aesthetic construct. It's a nests are part of mating rituals. And it also describes the interwoven narratives in Frankenstein. It's Shelley is suggesting how the text that it can provide us a home. This keeping, it can keep us. If a text about the body, a text that recognizes the body, rather than trying to regulate it, render it consistent in some kind of obedience to scientific and patriarchal power. So you can see the parallel between the kind of distorted reading of Walton and Victor's distorted education. It's distorted by, again, an intolerant, rigid patriarchal power. Remember, this recalls the kind of patriarchal scientific attitude of the narrator of We Are Seven, who likewise talked whose disregard for people, who's saying those people don't count. The girl's saying We Are Seven. He's saying no, you're wrong. You're counting people that don't count. That disregard of people is likened by Wordsworth to a disregard for words, throwing words away, throwing people away, throwing words away. The same attitude is expressed by Victor's father about his reading. My dear Victor, don't waste your time upon this. It is sad trash. So this kind of sets the scene for all the various kind of patriarchal male rivalries in the novel. So Victor says, I started reading him to spite my father. I started reading these books he didn't want me to, just to spite my father. So the idea is, male rivalry is about, I prove myself. It's like with Ozymandias. I prove myself by making you despair. I prove my mastery just by dominating you. It's a destructive identity. My power is proven by my capacity to for violence, basically, and that's expressed also a key symbol of the Promethean power in the novel, which also happens to be, I guess, a true event. This image of the stump blasted by a bolt of lightning. So he correlates the power of electricity with its capacity for destruction. The destructive power of electricity reflects that of patriarchy and vice versa. As I stood at the door after this stormy night, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. So again, that destruction of beauty. When we visited the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. So again, he's making explicit like the power I'm after is at odds with, contrasted with, that horrid contrast with life, the tree of life, the family tree. I can, my power, getting the power of electricity, discovering this power of life is a power uh, uh, of destruction. And he says it again in so many words: to discover the causes of life, we must have recourse to death. Um, it's a hallmark of our, cultural masterpieces or artistic masterpieces that they speak to, different moments of history, different perspectives, and so in such a wide variety of ways. Like Ozymandias, the the reading of passion speaks to all these different perspectives and speaks to every new reader of the poem. And that's, like Ozymandias, that's this variety, these eccentricities of experience are exactly what Walton would like to regulate and render consistent, reduce to one consistency according to one rule, one vision, one authority. But so I'm really struck how powerfully Frankenstein speaks to our recent, discussion about our cultural discussion about toxic masculinity, which isn't, anything new. I think it's just toxic masculinity is what it had been describing in terms of patriarchy. But I guess what's maybe new is sort of the nakedness of the toxicity of the just inane violence, and that's something that this novel really explores. I think we have a lot to learn from it. So let's look now at Frankenstein's backstory. This is a passage I think I read, plenty of times without really paying much attention to it. But it's, again, like the beginning of Walton's narrative. If you look at it, it's a really subtly but powerfully distorted perspective. Reveals this dimension, this toxic dimension of patriarchy. So yeah, what strikes you, and what matters to Victor in his self-narration? How try to again, like when you're reading Victor's account of the birth of the creature, try to distinguish what he's actually saying from his characterization of what he's saying, because I think there's a disconnect. If you realize what he's actually saying, it makes his characterization, his kind of blanket characterization, either of the monster, of the creature's monstrosity, or of his family's virtue, questionable. I am by birth a Genovese. My family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics. Lawyers, the agents of the law. Politicians, the acknowledged legislators. And my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. And it was not until the decline of his life that he thought of marrying. That family even occurred to him, and bestowing on the state sons who might carry his virtues and his name down to posterity. So, not only an agent of the law, from a long line of agents of the law, but he even thinks of his family for the sake of perpetuating his name in this kind of legal reality. And that's not all. I mean, listen to how the family he ends up with. How does he get his family? As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell through numerous mischances, eccentricities of life, accidents of life, into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, beautiful and strong, was of a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been distinguished for his rank and magnificence. So here again, we're getting exposed. It's characterized as virtue, but we're actually, what he's narrating is the toxic, destructive effects of pride. It's because he's so proud that these bad consequences follow. That his pride makes his misfortune, actually destructive. Caroline's time was more entirely occupied in attending him. Her means of subsistence decreased, and in the 10th month, her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly when my father entered the chamber. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend, he conducted her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife. Victor's narrative here is a prototypical patriarchal narrative. It's the prototype of a patriarchal narrative. Insofar as it disguises in a charitable, heroic motive, a destructive way of arranging bodies, a destructive culture. So Beaufort is strong and proud and beautiful until he isn't. And then he crashes and burns and takes his daughter down with him, which makes her available as, a piece of property for another man to inherit and just claim. So this black and white, like either it's sort of an all-powerful man, or you're trash, dispensable, or either a wretched man or a commodified female. So we see this pattern in all these different relationships. Victor's dad adopts Caroline. Then Elizabeth is adopted, which ends up killing Caroline. Elizabeth gets sick, and Caroline's so attached to her that she infects herself too and gets sick. Victor's love of Elizabeth is described like a kind of a love for a pet, a veneration that's actually kind of enslavement. And Justine is adopted. she and it ends up being sacrificed. We see a kind of repetition of in her abandonment of the monster. Um, Interesting question. And again, this sort of the patriarchal narcissism, it is correlated with self-pity, and in Beaufort, and also in Victor, his narrative is full of self-pity that it is actually really destructive. It ends up killing Justine. He says he has it worse than Justine because she got executed for his crime. So again, Felix, we see a repetition of Felix adopting Safie, just like Alphonse adopted Caroline. And Walton adopts Victor. We adopt, so I guess it all sort of sets this scene for our reading of the creature. How are we reading the creature? As another in this series of coercive adoptions, domineering, tyrannical adoptions, or is, I think, what Shelley is teaching us to read in a different way, asking us if we can read in a different way, rather than just as another repetition of this kind of cycle, all these cycles of violence, all these repetitions of patriarchal violence. And again, Victor spells out this tyrannical dimension of his patriarchal desires remarkably explicitly. So he says of his ambition to create a creature, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. So he wants to be a god. And many happy, excellent natures would owe their being to me, owe it. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. So, I mean, effectively, he wants to replace the family with law. I will deserve it. They will owe it to me. Love. He wants to control it and own it. To own it. As by law. So again, it's like he's expressing this patriarchal desire. It's like Ozymandias wants to become king of kings. I want to become the father of all fathers. It's just taking this principle of power as the end all and be all of life. So again, I think Shelley's really clearly pointing out this disguised violence, disguised principle of violence, and so they're making it a question of reading, our ability to read that violence in her text. Another really a great example of that is the reference to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in Walton's text, of just ridiculous misreading that would be comic if it weren't, again, so toxic. He thinks he can console her because he's not going to kill an albatross, so don't worry about my safety. So again, that this patriarchal power and ambition is correlated with misreading. Walton's misreading is particularly evident if you think about what the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is really about, which isn't anything so simple as don't kill an albatross, but it's about this, very weird challenge of paying attention to the strange otherness of the embodied world, the strange foreignness of the mariner's body, the strange foreignness of the snakes in the sea, learning to pay attention and respect and acknowledgement of the embodied environment and embodied others, other creatures, both human and non-human, which Walton and the rest of these men obviously are failing to do in a grotesque way. So if any superpower distinguishes humans, it isn't the power to create life. All organic life forms can do that. But the power to imagine and empathize with other lives, which Victor and these other patriarchal figures persistently and disastrously resist. This capacity to empathize with other bodies is consistently resisted by characters in the book. And so that, I think, Shelley is pointing to the reader to fill this gap of paying attention to, acknowledging embodied experience. That all the men in the novel are mistaking, they're misreading that as control, as like this godlike control and power and pride, ownership.